Hey everybody, it's Andy and welcome back to my office in Modesto, California. If you're new to the channel, I'm an attorney licensed to practice law in California as well as New York. If you're not new to the channel, you've no doubt seen this background and seen me make that intro a whole bunch of times before. In this video, what I'm going to talk about today, it's a little bit of a departure for me, so I don't really do a whole lot of corporations type work, like, with entities, LLCs and so forth. I do some, but I don't really do a whole lot of it. Certainly don't blog about a whole lot of it, don't make videos about it and so forth. If this video does well, I might actually change that a little bit, I don't know. So if you would like to hear more about corporations and LLCs and business type stuff like that, leave me a comment down below. If there's interest, I'm more than happy to kind of make more content that way. So anyway, so the topic of today's video basically is going to be, can a corporation or an entity, like a corporate entity of some kind, represent itself in legal proceedings? So in other words, can a corporation represent itself in court, let's say? So here's the situation that I often encounter, and it arises often enough, I think, that courts actually have kind of methods of dealing with this. So the situation basically is like this. Over the last, I would say maybe 10 years, possibly a little bit more, like 15 years maybe, 10, 15 years or so, over that time period, corporations, LLCs, limited partnerships, that kind of thing, all of those have become a lot more common in the last 10 to 15 years. A lot of it, I think, is because those entities that years ago you would need an attorney to go help you, form them, now you can form them online for, I don't know, $59, $99 or something. So you can form a corporation in California, an LLC in Nevada, LLC in Delaware, whatever. So there's good and bad, with that. So it's something where, if, I guess, more accessibility, I suppose, but at the same time, a lot of people now have corporations, LLCs and so forth who don't really know how to really deal with them a lot of the time. So the question, I guess the situation that I see is this. So let's say that you have a corporation and you are basically conducting business, everything's fine. And it turns out one day, however, that you get sued by a vendor, let's say. Or some vendor doesn't pay you, or some customer doesn't pay you, and now you have to go sue them to get paid. Can a corporation like that represent itself in court? Now, if it's a person, the answer to that question is yes. A person, an actual individual, can represent themselves in court. You might have heard the terms, they're Latin terms, I believe. Pro per, in propria persona. And then pro se is also a way to kind of refer to somebody who has no attorney. So an unrepresented individual in court, no big deal. Here's where it's different though. A corporation, LLC, limited partnership, etc., cannot represent itself in a legal proceeding. If you're trying to, basically, save some money, for example, and you went through the kind of process to form an LLC, corporation, whatever, can you represent the LLC in court? If you're not an attorney, the answer is no, you can't. So if you went through the process of forming an entity of some kind, thinking, oh, hey, I'm going to minimize my taxes, I'm going to protect myself from being sued, blah, blah, okay. That's good. Like, that's certainly what business entities are for. The downside, the cost, I guess, if you want to call it that, the cost of doing that is that your entity now, remember, your entity is now separate from you, different taxpayer ID, it has its own bank accounts, it can own property, etc. Your entity is actually distinct from you, so it's like a person, right? Your corporation owns stuff, has bank accounts just like a normal person, an individual would. So if you're not an attorney and you're trying to represent a person, like a corporation, you basically can't. You're a non-attorney trying to represent somebody or something, I guess, else, and you generally can't do that. Technically, I've never seen a judge do this, but technically that is unauthorized practice of law. In California, that's actually a misdemeanor. It's Business and Professions Code section 6126, if you're interested. I'll write that up over here. So bottom line then is, if you went through the process to form an LLC, a corporation, etc., over the last 10 or 15 years or so, because you thought, hey, I'm running a business, it's the prudent thing to do, great. One kind of downside or surprise, I guess, most kind of, entity owners are surprised by this, is that if you went through all that effort to form an entity, that entity is distinct from you, and you, a non-attorney, cannot represent that entity in legal proceedings. If you do, technically, it's unauthorized practice of law. So hopefully that makes sense. An entity always has to be represented by an attorney when it comes to court proceedings. That's kind of the bottom line. If you need authority for that, the court case that I always cite to is called CLD Construction versus City of San Ramon. I believe it's a 2004 Court of Appeals case. I'll write that here. And I'll link it down below for you, like a Google Scholar link or something. But yeah, CLD Construction is what I always cite to it when a corporation, for whatever reason, is trying to represent itself in court because it doesn't want to hire an attorney, there's no money to hire an attorney, etc. So yeah, hopefully that kind of makes sense. If you read over CLD Construction, it basically goes over the unauthorized practice of law thing that I mentioned earlier. So hopefully that made sense. Just remember, the takeaway from this video, if you formed an LLC, corporation, any other type of entity like that, generally speaking, you cannot, as a non-attorney, represent it in court. An entity like that, like a corporation, always has to have an attorney when they go to court. Yeah, that's the CLD Construction case, if that helps you. So again, I'll link it down below, CLD Construction. But yeah, in a nutshell, just if you have a corporation, LLC, whatever, hire an attorney. That's just the cost of doing business. All right. If you don't do that, like if you try to basically represent a corporation, if you're not an attorney, or if like if you're the president of the company and you want to represent the corporation, if you're not an attorney, you can't do that. Number one, the courts will not allow that. And the other party is entitled to file something called a motion to strike. That's going to be beyond the scope of this video, but that's basically Code of Civil Procedure, Section 435-ish in California. So motion to strike would be the penalty. It's just not worth it. Just if you have an entity, corporation, etc., hire an attorney before going to court. It's basically that simple. All right? Yeah, hopefully that helped, and I will talk to you guys next time. Thanks.